On May 6, 1945, two middle-ranking SS officers stood on a small road bridge in the Austrian alpine resort of Altazi. Below them raced a clear mountain stream, and above loomed the giant pale grey limestone of the Loser Plateau. Nearby stood several wooden houses and cottages, whose gemütlich interiors are designed for late-night schnapps in front of fires after exhausting mountain hikes or invigorating swims in the therapeutic waters of the lake. However, neither man would have had his mind on such pleasant activities. Instead, they were discussing their options now that the American tanks were just a few miles away. As SS officers, neither relished the prospect of Allied captivity, yet both had different ideas of their next moves. The younger man, an SS Sturmbannführer, the equivalent of a major in the German army, intended to stay. A member of the Nazi Party since he was 16, the 30-year-old Dr. Wilhelm Hotel had spent his war working for the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, the SS intelligence service, and had served in Vienna, Berlin, and Budapest. Although his career was meteoric, he was not without his detractors. One of his superiors had described him as the typical troublesome Viennese, a liar, a toady, a schemer, and a pronounced operator. Such qualities are arguably useful for intelligence work, and it was these that Hotel intended to draw on. With his experience of waging a secret war against communist cells, he reckoned that he might be of use to the Americans, and instead of treating him as a war criminal, they might even regard him as an asset. Hotel's hopes were far from vain. Since February, he had been in contact with the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, in an attempt to broker a separate peace deal for his native Austria. The putative deal was codenamed Herzog and was the formulation of Hotel's boss, SS Obergruppenführer General Ernst Kaltenbrunner, himself an Austrian and the head of the Reich Security Main Office, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, or RSHA. Hotel had made several trips to Switzerland to talk to representatives of Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief in Bern, and he was keen to ingratiate himself with the Americans, offering them information about Axis military preparations for a desperate last stand in the so-called Alpine Redoubt, as well as about gold shipments that were to be buried deep in the Austrian mountains. Unfortunately for Hotel, events overtook him, and before he could arrange a meeting between Dulles and Kaltenbrunner, an independent Austria was declared in Russian-occupied Vienna on April 27th. Hotel made a final attempt to reach Switzerland at the beginning of May, but with French troops on the Austro-Swiss border, he was forced to stop when he had reached Liechtenstein and returned to seek refuge in Altazi. Unbeknown to him, the Americans were indeed making plans for his exploitation. On April 21st, Dulles reported that Hotel's record as an SD man and a collaborator of Kaltenbrunner is of course bad, but I believe he desires to save his skin and therefore may be useful. Another OSS officer agreed, although he advised caution. To avoid any accusation that we are working with a Nazi reactionary, reported Edgeworth Murray Leslie to Dulles, I believe that we should keep our contact with him as indirect as possible. The other man standing on the bridge that day did not share Hotel's fluid sense of loyalty to the Nazi regime. 9 years older and 1 rank senior, the SS Obersturmbannführer, Lieutenant Colonel, was far more interested in peace deals and was convinced that the fight was still worth waging. He told Hotel that his intention was to hide in the mountains with a group of trustworthy young SS men, where he felt his alpine skills would enable him to survive for years. Hotel would have had no doubt that his superior was sincere, as he had witnessed the depth of his commitment to the evils of Nazism. In fact, the two men had worked together in Hungary, after the Germans had occupied that country the previous March. Hotel's job was to run SD counter-espionage operations, while his fellow Austrian's brief was to implement the role of the bland-sounding Referat 4, B4 of the RSHA in the newly occupied territory. The Obersturmbannführer was to do his job well and with much zeal, because by June 1944 he had managed to deport some 400,000 Jews to be gassed at Birkenau. The older man's name was Adolf Eichmann.